In the middle of the multi-month calamity of the 1904 St. Louis Olympics, the IOC holds a session in London. None of the problems with the currently unfinished and disintegrating St. Louis Games are discussed. The IOC must look forward to where their next contest will be held. The Olympics at this point aren't a large enough financial burden on the larger events they're generally attached to really worry about themselves turning a profit. Despite Pierre's constant frustration at playing second fiddle to various World's Fairs, this setup provides financial security in exchange for international prestige. The Olympics may be a sideshow of the latest technological craziness on display at the World's Fair, but at least the IOC won't go broke. The IOC takes a vote between three possible host cities: Berlin, Rome, and Turin, none of which are hosting a World's Fair in the coming years, again much to the Baron Pierre de Coubertin's delight. Finally, the Olympics will be its own thing, as financially risky as that might be. This is to be the second ever Olympics to be held completely independently, after the first in Athens in 1896. Rome is chosen from the three nominees. The IOC also finally decides on the question of Greek versus international hosting duties, essentially compromising with the Greeks. The IOC allows Athens to hold its own quasi-Olympics, to be called the Intercalated Games, in 2-year cycles in between Olympics. On April 5th, 1906, Mount Vesuvius erupts. 3 weeks later, the 1906 Athens Games begin. The Athens Games are the most Olympic, non-Olympic games ever held. In contrast with the 1904 St. Louis Olympics, perhaps the most non-Olympic Olympic Games ever held. You may be saying, why are you not doing a whole video on these 1906 Athens Olympics? Didn't anything interesting happen in them? If they're so proper and official, why aren't you treating them like real Olympics? Well, they're no longer considered official Olympic canon. This is now Olympic Apocrypha, and as a dedicated Olympic Protestant, I feel it's my duty to treat them as unofficial. Also, the fact that they were so Olympic and so efficiently and expertly run, like the first games, makes them basically uninteresting. It was such a replay of the first games, the little surviving footage of these 1906 games is actually mistakenly labeled as footage of the 1896 games on YouTube, and I even used it in my video without any of you even realizing it. Without the novelty of being the first modern games, the 1906 proceedings are honestly much less interesting. Important Olympic traditions like the unified opening and closing ceremonies with athletes marching in teams under their national flags were set up, which is going to cause some political drama in London 2 years later, which I will get to. We also see the debut of the concept of an Olympic athletes' village. These games mostly occurred without scandal, under budget, and in a reasonable 12 days, not the multi-month disorganized mess of the last few. The athletes even ran the marathon without much of a hitch. No cheaters and an underdog Canadian victory. Also, interestingly, the French topped the medal table, doing uncharacteristically well. Too bad these results are relegated to the dustbin of Olympic history because they don't count anymore, at least as far as the IOC is concerned now. If you see an all-time Olympic medal tally of any sort, it's not going to count these games. The 1906 games went off mostly perfectly, and were a much-needed win for the IOC, who are beginning to look very bad at this whole international organization planning thing. A no-nonsense, profitable, and brief sports contest basically showed the world they could still run an event, as long as it was simplified and not adorned with a bunch of unnecessary nonsense. The IOC was still in crisis. Italy is reeling from the Vesuvius eruption and has halted planning the Olympics completely, instead funneling all of the money they were going to spend on the Olympics into rebuilding Naples' destroyed suburbs. As you may remember, Italy provided 66% of the possible host cities, so I guess the 1908 games are going to Berlin? Berlin says they'd rather not, and then pull out, for whatever reason. I can't seem to find the exact reason Berlin seems so eager in 1904, and then by 1906 is like not into it. I think perhaps because they realized that planning a games on such a a strict timeline is going to be very hard. Britain swoops in at the last moment and tells Pierre de Coubertin, "We'll host the 1908 Games in London." Pierre is at first thrilled until he learns the full British plan. They're going to fold the Games into yet another international exposition, this time the already under construction Franco-British Exhibition of 1908, to be held in White City, a new development in Shepherd's Bush, a recently developed parcel of West London, now home to some of London's first suburban sprawl, Metroland as they call it. Pierre, briefly happy after his re-election as head of the IOC, lets loose one manly tear of frustration as his beloved Olympics will again play second fiddle to a World's Fair. And this isn't even actually a World's Fair technically, it's just a French and British fair to celebrate some sort of military alliance that would really only become important in 1914 when World War I starts. The UK is given the equivalent of around £5 million in today's money, more like in the tens of thousands back in 1906, to build a new stadium, and they hustle to complete the centerpiece of the exposition grounds, White City Stadium. No more tiny track oval next to the bathroom for the Olympics. Another £1 million are thrown at the other facilities and events. Although the Olympics are folded into an exposition, at least they're center stage this time. Baron Desborough also booked several Olympic sports for posh venues in London's West End. Thankfully, the Franco-British Exhibition was coming along ahead of schedule, and the new Olympic buildings weren't too big of a strain. So I feel like I should explain what this expo was about. There wasn't much in the way of new technology, except a brand new tube station at Wood Lane, and a major overhaul of the existing one at Shepherd's Bush. Wood Lane would serve as the mold for a number of expansions of the London Underground into London's first ring of suburbs, that it had grown like a scraggly beard during the population boom of the Victorian Industrial Revolution. Although tellingly, the fancier West End burbs would be serviced before the more working-class East End ones. This exposition was mainly for showcasing political dominance, hence the centerpiece attraction, 2 replica villages showing life in each empire's colonial fringes. A mock Irish village called Ballymaclinton, and a mock Senegalese one, which was unnamed. The fair was also designed to bring the French and British populaces together, despite the group's 100-year-long blood feud. Why? Because the UK and France wanted to counter the German Empire. France, after all, had lost to them really badly in the Franco-Prussian War like 30 years beforehand. Prior to the opening day of London 1908, it's decided that these games will be streamlined into a couple of weeks of continuous events in late April and early May, rather than many events scattered over a couple of months like in 1904. These games will be the longest on paper, but that's only because they waited until October to try winter sports for the first time, in the form of a figure skating competition. Most of the contest was in a pretty concise 2-week period. 1906 reform of judging will also cause lowered tensions in the more subjectively judged events, as judging panels will be international now, rather than just supplied by the local hosts, which obviously caused a lot of problems in prior events. Finally, Edward VII, the king, agrees to open the games. No offense to David R. Francis, the former governor of Missouri and mayor of St. Louis, but having the king of the British Empire open your games makes it seem a little bit more legit. Edward VII, Queen Victoria's son, not much of an athlete and now aged 67 and beady-eyed, king for the last 7 years, kind of grumbles his way through the opening through very posh British teeth. This would be the first Olympics to have an opening ceremony, with athletes all in big clumps marching behind their flag and country name sign. This would cause a number of problems as people get very upset about things like flags and names. For one, newcomer New Zealand was merged with Australia to create the non-country Olympic country Australasia with special custom flag in tow. Another newcomer, Finland, fielded a surprisingly large team, bigger than Italy's actually, despite not even really being an independent country yet. Finland was still technically a duchy of the Russian Empire, at least on paper. Finland wanted to march under their white flag with the blue cross, but Russia protested, insisting they march behind the Russian tricolor. The IOC compromises and they march under nothing, just a sign saying Finland. The other newcomer, the Ottoman Empire, competing under the name Turkey, enters competition with only one entrant, a Greek gymnast. Again, with the names and the flags, Great Britain plans to compete as Great Britain, just that. But Ireland, boiling over with nationalist and separatist sentiment in 1908, protests. The compromise name, Great Britain/Ireland, and the fact that Ireland still had to march under the Union Jack didn't really make anybody happy. The final controversy came about the very day of the opening ceremony. The American team, largely composed of old money American exceptionalist New Englanders, or more working-class Irish Americans, both groups not fond of monarchy or its theatrics, nearly unanimously votes to not dip the flag in reverence to Edward VII, unlike every other country, even Germany, with all its military tension. A final thing to note is, as you might have noticed, these are the first Olympics to be caught on film. It seems as though only about 10 minutes of footage survives, and not from every sport, but it's a great start. The French film company Pathé Frères, now the French media giant Pathé, and the British newsreel titan cum archivists British Pathé, who, as the name suggests, are formerly a British branch of Pathé, sent a few cameramen to document the games for the Pathé newsreels, as well as to provide content for Pathé's exhibit at the Franco-British Exhibition. So with all of that out of the way, let's get down to the actual sports and see if anything particularly interesting happened on the field. Weirdly, the archery, at least for the men, was divided into double York style and continental style. Like many of these early sports, there was a significant difference in how the game was played from country to country. These were the days before international standardization was pretty common in sports, and this setup necessitated, in the eyes of the IOC, different events for different styles of play. This kind of defeats the purpose of international competition, though, in my opinion, as the Brits cleaned up in the York contest with the French trailing them, and then for the continental style, which the French team was more familiar with, it was the exact opposite, with French archers completely outshooting the Brits. Gymnastics. Despite being some of the most thoroughly filmed events of these Olympics, these are not particularly interesting. The results weren't even fully known until a couple of years ago. The events were thankfully simplified, so now there's just a team and an individual event, using whatever form of gymnastics each team pleased, and then judged subjectively by a panel. No more different types of gymnastics for different countries. The teams were still huge, though, allowing up to 40 gymnasts per team. In the individual, the continental gymnasts excelled, but the Scandinavians held down the more Swedish system-focused team events. Alright, so athletics. The blue ribbon events at this Olympics, and all of the previous ones, the athletics events, specifically the track running, were finally eyed by an international audience. Unlike at St. Louis, all the top amateur track runners from America, the continent, and the British Empire were in London in 1908. Track running fans finally had a reason to pay attention to the Olympics, after the first three track contests proved woefully underwhelming on an international scale. Much of the top talent wasn't there, off running more important races somewhere else, but in 1908, all of the talent was in London. The contest was made even higher stakes with a change of format for each event. In track events, heats are held, and the winner of each heat either goes on to a semi-final or the final race, depending on how many athletes are in each event. Usually, the top 2 to 3 places in each heat advance to the next round, maybe 4 if you're being generous, but in London 1908, they had too many athletes to do this. After all, almost all of the fastest men in Europe and America were in London that summer. The IOC introduces a sudden death format. Only the flat-out winner of each heat would advance until 4 to 8 runners were decided for the final. Because of the sudden death format, Britain's favorite in the contest, Jack Morton, was knocked out early. The Brits still walked away happy, as for the first time the Americans weren't the dominant track power. Well, technically they were, winning the most medals of any single nation, but if you count the Commonwealth teams, the Brits still walked away with a majority. You gotta remember that back in 1908, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were very much still, strongly linked with the British politically and culturally in kind of a way that they aren't as much now. One of these victories, the gold for British runner Wyndham Halswell, what a name, proves that even with an updated and more international judging panel, judging disputes, even in the non-subjective events like track running, were still rampant. the judges rule a number of runners should be disqualified for blocking and jockeying for position during the race, which is apparently not allowed. They order the final to be rerun, now not including the disqualified runners, but Halswell is the only runner not disqualified, so he just runs the race by himself. For a surreal 50 seconds, he's the only man on the track, guaranteed success. Halswell would be embroiled in an ensuing scandal, causing friction between the American and British running communities. The Americans obviously felt snubbed. Halswell tries to act as peacemaker, to little success. In the distance running, the Commonwealth again excels, aided partially by French runner Jean Bouin getting shit-faced and ruining France's chances in the 3-mile team race. For the 4th Olympic marathon, a number of things are nailed down. The length is fixed at 26.2 miles. Why 0.2? Well, the last 0.2 miles is added so the runners could begin under the East Terrace of Windsor Castle, which is uncoincidentally where the king sleeps. 26.2 miles later, the runners are to enter White City Stadium in the Tony West London suburbs. This distance would stand as the official length of a marathon ever since. The course is rather bizarre looking at it now on a map. Rather than wind the marathon past the most iconic landmarks of London, most of which are located in central London, we instead, like in 1904, get a rather uneventful tour of, at the time, sparsely populated, if occasionally increasingly ritzy West London suburbs. Who needs Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus when you can have Slough?
Slough?
This was likely to avoid the mess of the 1900 marathon, wound through the dense urban core of Paris, and a complete mess with no clear definitive course, as you might remember. The weather, cursing these games, reached an unseasonably balmy 80 degrees. The Brits had very little chance of winning the marathon. 2/3 of their runners didn't even finish. Tommy Clark came closest, but only got 12th place. This was seen as largely an American and Canadian contest. So it's a little after 2 hours into the marathon. The main pack is passing Wembley's High Street en route to White City. The Americans, Hayes, Forshaw, and Welton, are predictably in the lead, with Canadians Wood, Simpson, and Lawson trailing them. But one surprise is hidden in the pack. Durando Pietri, one of only 2 Italian runners, the other having passed out back in Harrow, is fighting with the Americans for the pole position. He's dying inside, still in the race on pure inertia, because in the course of this mad pursuit, his body keeps forgetting to shut down. It's around 2 hours and 55 minutes into the marathon, and the first entrant into the stadium is the tired Italian Durando Pietri, gaunt, drained of fluids, running on an empty in a very visceral sense. Upon passing the cycling track and hitting the running track, Pietri starts running in the wrong direction, before being realigned by officials. He's falling over, starting and stopping abruptly with his gaze fixed permanently on the finish line. A squad of doctors props him up and guides him like a human cloud to the finish line. Durando's cloud of doctors, feeding him sips of brandy and smelling salts, doomed him to eventual disqualification. The Americans complained, saying Pietri wouldn't have finished the race without constant prodding and dragging, which, fair, but come on, guys. Silver medalist, the American runner Johnny Hayes, gets retroactively bumped up to a gold medal, much to Durando Pietri's frustration. Johnny Hayes was a stock clerk at the palatial New York Bloomingdale's, and he trained on their rooftop track in Manhattan in between selling, quote, hats and male accessories, as he said. His advice for the marathon: before you leave, eat a hamburger slider, drink a cup of green tea. Don't bring anything with you on the race except cologne and brandy, and apply each to your face liberally. Also, don't smoke cigarettes. This is guaranteed success with the Johnny Hayes method. The hurdle events held after the marathon were American gimmies. The American team was again mad this time because they were being asked to run on Sunday. This whole argument again, oh my gosh. The American runner Forrest Smithson even invents the annoying Christian sports moment when he poses for a photo jumping over a hurdle while holding a Bible, again to protest having to run on Sunday. Proto Tebow does win gold though. Harry Porter jumped almost 2 meters in a wool sweater in the long jump, amazingly. As I said, the weather cursed these Olympics, and it was either too cold and rainy and overcast to really do anything, or too hot. Ray Urey continues his unmatched streak of dominance at the weird standy jumps, even beating a guy named Clitoris at the standing long jump. And the Irish whale still dominate all the throwing events, except the javelin, which is more popular in Scandinavia. Boxing. So the boxing here was only slightly more international than in 1904. No Americans boxed this time. It was mostly a match between British and French boxers, and the Brits swept the entire thing. They crammed the entire boxing program strangely into one day, meaning the lightweights had to fight 4 times in a single day to clinch the title. Unfortunately, there's not much footage of this. Cycling. The track cycling was held concurrently with some of the track events in the same arena. In certain clips from the gymnastics and track and field, you can actually see the cycle races going on in the background. As you can tell by some of these clips, these days of cycling were not well attended. The sand track flooded constantly as the weather in London for the games was expectedly grey and miserable, and all of the finalists in the 1,000-meter race were so slow, they were all disqualified for taking too long, and nobody got a medal. Diving. The diving saw no major highlights. The Germans took the springboard while the Swedes took the platform. The diving saw a brush with death, though, when a British diver passed out on the way into the pool from an unknown cause. Thankfully, he was fine. So, fencing. A cultural divide was forming in European fencing by 1908. The sport of fencing usually involves 3 contests, using 3 distinct types of sword. Foil is a delicate dance of flexible, thin metal swords. Called foils, you win by scoring touches on the opponent. In 1908, the French primarily scored foil events by style, according to a panel of judges, and because of this, foil wasn't actually contested in 1908 because they didn't, know how to judge it fairly. It's just like, who's the most fancy,
This is the correct execution of a straight thrust from medium distance against various invitations.
Foil fencing in this period in 1908 was still dominated by aristocrats with bushy mustaches and double-barreled surnames. If you look at the roles of the people who entered into the non-medal demonstration foil events, these are very aristocratic names. Count Lada Sazovsky, Count Goppold Z. Lobsdorfu, Count Urkrath de Berry, etc. These are very rich people. The other 2 sword types were contested at London in 1908 competitively, though. Épée is like foil, but a bit thicker and less bendy. It's a slower form of fencing than foil, but uses the same touch-based scoring method. The épée fencers at 1908 were primarily upper-middle-class to upper-class urban continental types. France and Belgium did very well, mostly pulling their fencers from the cast of fashionable rich layabouts. It was a different story in the final discipline though, saber fencing. Saber fencing is generally less reserved, allowing slashes. It's the most similar to actual sword fighting. Long derided by épéeurs and foilists as barbaric and overly martial, it's embraced by the upwardly mobile Jewish middle class of Eastern Europe. Hungary dominates saber fencing, with Jewish fencers Jeno Fuchs, Lajos Werkner, and Oskar Gerde dominating the field of largely aristocratic European Gentiles. Gerde would later be murdered in the Holocaust. Despite making up only 5% of Hungary's population, Jewish athletes won 56% of Hungary's gold medals between 1896 and 1912. A lot of them in one of Hungary's first truly dominant sports, saber fencing. And setting the stage for a Hungarian win streak in the saber events that would, except for in 1920 when Hungary was banned, stand unbroken until 1968. Soccer, or football, since we are in England. Since the St. Louis Games, Robert Guérin had convened a meeting in Paris to found FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. FIFA was not the first international organization founded to govern international play in a sport, but it would go on to be the largest and most important of all of the sports bodies by the 20th and 21st century. Much like the World Cup is a combination of the top soccer talent in the world, FIFA is constantly running a sort of corruption World Cup to determine who's the best at taking massive bribes. FIFA has robbed and stolen its way to the top, beating out even the Olympics, which is supposed to be the patriarch of each of these sports orgs. FIFA's World Cup consistently garners as many or more viewers than the entire Olympics, and FIFA has been able to keep the top soccer players out of the Olympics, even today. So if you watch a soccer contest in the Olympics, it's not going to be the top guys, because FIFA does not want competition with their own, quattro yearly event, the World Cup. Importantly here, FIFA whipped the soccer tournament into shape, abandoning the format of just pitting a few assorted club teams against each other, which we saw at the previous Olympics. Now we have legitimate national sides competing for the medals, albeit just European teams, and only 5 of them: England, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, and France. The matches were super high scoring, which was more typical of the time. Great Britain knocked Sweden out of the tournament 12-0. Denmark upped the ante with an all-time Olympic scoring record in soccer, beating France's A-team 17-1. Sophus Nielsen nabs 10 goals himself, absolutely deflating France's outmatched goalie Maurice Tilliet. Field hockey. Making its Olympic debut, field hockey, the much less popular, at least in America, cousin of ice hockey, is actually the original type of hockey played at the Olympics. They actually still do field hockey in the Olympics to this day. Bet you didn't know or care about that. Only 3 nations were in the pool though: Britain, Germany, and France. Right before competition, the Irish complained about not being allowed their own Irish team. Scotland and Wales joined Ireland's side, and Team Britain was severed into 4 teams. England takes gold over Ireland's silver in the final with a brutal 8-1 victory. Scotland and Wales tie for bronze, which technically means that the United Kingdom won all of the medals in the field hockey tournament in 1908. Jeu de Paume. What is this weird sport, you say? Apparently, also known as real tennis, it's like an older fancy-pants version of tennis, using smaller rackets and a cork ball. So who plays this anyway? Well, apparently rich British and American people. The gold medal went to Jay Gould Jr., son of Jay Gould Sr., the 19th century finance bro and railroad speculator who almost single-handedly broke Wall Street in 1869, triggering America's worst financial crisis since its founding. Other fancy-pants names like Eustace Miles and Neville Lytton won the other medals. Lacrosse. Despite not enjoying much international popularity, London 1908 hosted another lacrosse tournament. The originally native Canadian and American game had become a minor Edwardian fad back in the old country, but as today, lacrosse is not super popular in the United Kingdom, and most people didn't really know what was going on for each of these games. Apparently, lacrosse has complicated rules. I wouldn't know because I don't know the rules of lacrosse. Also, Canada won. Duh, of course. Motorboating. Why was this a sport in 1908? This is the traditional, boat kind of motorboating, not the kind that you do with boobs. Apparently, according to the Olympics' own rules, this sport shouldn't be allowed, as it involves non-human powered vehicles, motorboats. These races were a mess, a couple only having one finisher and having to be rerun multiple times because of terrible weather and 1908 boat technology. And also because, it's 1908, even the motorboat race was like 2 miles an hour top speed, and, mostly stationary because your state-of-the-art Edwardian motor yacht was just leaking coal dust into Southampton water instead of, moving forward most of the time. Polo. Again, polo, a weird sport for rich people without much international appeal, is included on the program, and wouldn't be until the post-World War II era that we rid ourselves of this dumb rich person sport. Anyway, as there was no FIFA for polo, we again have club teams competing, this time 3, Roehampton, Hurlingham, and a team out of Dublin. Let's move on. Rackets. Oh my god, with these fake rich people sports. Okay, so what is rackets now? It's not roque from last time, which you might remember is like a kind of weird version of croquet, that other old-timey bullshit sport. Okay, rackets, it's sort of an older form of racquetball, a bit like squash, I guess, if you know what that is. John Jacob Astor and other rich fucks compete at the Queen's Club, very exclusive. Only British people competed. Thankfully, this would get cut in further editions of the Olympics. Rowing. Held at the prestigious Henley Royal Regatta, these events were allegedly more interesting than their Olympic predecessors, but as someone who doesn't really know anything about rowing and can't really see much of these events on film, because they weren't filmed that much, they don't look particularly spectacular. The Brits did, well, as usual, winning every single gold. Alright, let's move on to the rugby. This was a bizarre tournament. Britain sent an invite to all the big rugby powers around the world, mostly their colonies who they, made like rugby by force, and all of them said no, except for Australia. The Australian rugby team was already on a fairly dominant tour of England at the time, and basically stopped by the Olympics to cinch another easy win. Britain probably could have put up more resistance, but their national rugby team was ironically on tour in Australia, also on their own little dominant streak. Instead, the Brits picked Cornwall, the winners of a national county-by-county competition, for the task. One of the guys in the Cornwall team was named Dick Jacket. Anyway, obviously the Australians steamrolled over Cornwall, the only other team in the tournament, 32-3, in the middle of a thick grey London downpour. So, sailing, again, these are strange inclusions in the Olympic program, including up to 40-foot vessels, and yes, I know they still do sailing events to this day, much to my confusion. The races weren't held in London on account of it being not near the ocean. The races instead headed in completely opposite directions. Most of the races were held off the Isle of Wight, the farthest south point of England, while the largest class was held in Glasgow, way up there in Scotland. A series of ridiculously named rich people owned the winning yachts and picked up the medals, and very little of it was filmed, so let's move on. The shooting. These events were dominated by Brits and Swedes, and particularly senior citizen Brits and Swedes. Joshua Milner and Oscar Swan both won gold medals despite being both 61 years old, which in 1908 years was like 98 years old. The only other real notable highlight, or lowlight if you were the Russian shooting team, is the Russian shooting team missing the entire event because they used the older Julian calendar. Otherwise, held mostly at the British Army-owned Bisley Range and on some fancy English manor for the trap shooting, they were mostly the same as what we have now. Swimming. The swimming in London in 1908 was allegedly very interesting. We had a more international field than in 1904. Like nearly every sport, so that's a plus, but Great Britain still nailed most of their competition. Even old champion Hungary's Zoltán von Halmay kinda ate shit, losing out to America's Charlie Daniels, no, not that one, in his signature event, the 100 meter. In the team relay, von Helme was still considered Hungary's strongest swimmer and swam anchor. He completely mistimed the event and overexerted himself in the first 100 meters, leaving him exhausted and disoriented for the second 100. Hungary lost to Britain's relay team. It's also always fun to read old swimming sources because they say things like Britain's best breaststroker or the Germans were the world's best breaststrokers in 1908. Maybe I need to grow up a little bit. Tennis. Okay, so on top of Jeu de Paume, which you remember is the fancy rich people version of tennis, these Olympics also had regular tennis, the type of tennis people today still give a shit about. It was still split into an indoor and outdoor tournament though, but women competed, but not in doubles for some reason. Most notable was the venue, the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club, or more famously, Wimbledon, where the apex of international tennis was held in 1908 and is still held today. However, unlike Wimbledon, which had 40 years of prestige by 1908, the more recent Olympics couldn't attract the top tennis talent, and much of it was barred by the Olympics' still very stringent amateur rules. Professional tennis was very much a big thing back then, and probably one of the most professional sports at the time. So, not a lot of people cared about this batch of Olympic tennis. It was largely a battle between Britain and Commonwealth players from South Africa or Australia, and a couple of Northern European players that bothered to make the journey to London off-season. So, Tug of War. This ridiculous event makes yet another appearance, despite causing confusion and frustration nearly every time it's included. Remember what happened in Paris? So, an American and Swedish national team entered, and the Brits stacked the deck with 3 teams of cops from the Liverpool Police, the London Metropolitan Police, and the City of London Police. Yes, London has 2 police forces, it's very complicated. I will link a video to explain why in the bottom, if you so care to know this. Anyway, the Americans lose to the Liverpool cops in a thinly attended tug, like many other events held in the middle of White City Stadium, while other events rage on in the background. The Americans complain that Liverpool is wearing shoes that are too big, which I guess is considered unkosher in the Tug of War community. Many long letters are exchanged, and the specifics of Tug of War footwear are discussed to a truly painful degree. Prominent prior Olympians wrote long op-eds in prominent newspapers about the international incident, and nobody really cared. You'd think this would be the final nail in the coffin for Tug of War, but nope, it'll be here for another decade plus. Water polo. The Americans didn't enter a team on account of most of their top water poloists contracting typhus in St. Louis' 1904 water polo pool, which, if you recall, was actually an artificial lake made of sewage and cow manure. Hungary also pulled out, leaving a 4-team field: Great Britain, Belgium, Sweden, and the Netherlands. The Brits and Belgians, the 2 best water polo nations in Europe, aside from Hungary, which wasn't there, rematched in 1908, resuming their interrupted national rivalry from Paris 1900. Thankfully, unlike in 1904, the 1908 water polo events ended with a death toll of 0. Wrestling. The last event of the main chunk of sports I'm going to talk about right now, the ones held concurrently with the Franco-British Exhibition, is the wrestling. Greco-Roman style wrestling is back after its America-mandated absence in 1904, and the Scandinavians, Americans, and Brits each do pretty well. After the wrestling, the last day of festivities at White City Stadium saw a non-medal demonstration of a couple of sports. One of these, Glima, saw Icelandic competitors who wrestled for Denmark in prior days returning to demonstrate their native form of wrestling, a more rough and tumble and less formal form. Another sport, bicycle polo, was demonstrated by its eccentric Irish inventor and only eager booster, cycling rider R.J. McCready. It's basically just polo, but on bikes instead of horses. It does make up for polo's elitist nature, allowing anyone with the money to scrape up a bicycle access to the formerly rich man's pursuit, but what it gains in accessibility is lost in how stupid and dangerous it is. Figure skating. Before we call it a day, let's speed forward a few months to October, for the last medal sport in this Olympics. It's frigid in London, and the 1908 Olympics are still happening technically on paper. For the first time, the IOC debuts a winter sport as part of the festivities, albeit several months after all of the others. Figure skating was held at the exclusive members-only Prince's Skating Club in the affluent Knightsbridge section of West London. I don't really know what happened at these figure skating events, as there's not a lot of documentation of, the specifics, aside from who competed, but they likely wouldn't dazzle modern audiences used to insane quintuple spins and skaters wearing clothing that allowed more mobility than like a 3-piece suit. Nikolai Kolomenkin, the aristocratic Russian champ, also competes but adopts an alias, Nikolai Panin, to avoid getting called gay by his college friends when he gets back home to St. Petersburg. That's actually why he did. I'm not making a joke. That's literally the reason. So, as in Paris and St. Louis, these early Olympics were considered fairly unimportant, especially in relation to the more notable World's Fairs they were attached to. No sports biopics, inspiring or otherwise, have been set at the red-headed stepchildren of the Olympics. London was more financially solvent than its predecessors and less of a self-evident massive international failure, though, which is good. International competition was still very limited, though. This was more of a proto-Commonwealth Games than a true Olympics, but at least there was some entry from the continent and America to give the Brits a fight. Britain still came out on top of the very lopsided medal count, ending this relatively uninspiring and non-notable series of non-events. At the end of the 1908 Olympics, the site of the next contest in 1912 is still not known, to be determined at a meeting in Berlin the following year. Berlin and Stockholm are the leading and right now only candidates, so it's likely to be one of the two. And what happened with that giant white city complex they built for the exposition? Well, now it's kind of another overblown complex. It's mostly a giant shopping center now, though, that according to locals is very annoying, so that's good.